This episode contains discussion about sensitive topics, including child abuse and death. Listener discretion is advised.
Even if your kid goes to public school, private school, unless you are just comfortable handing your child over to the state for all the compulsory ages that they want to take and telling the state, teach them whatever you think is best and just send them back to me when you're done. If you're not comfortable with that position, then what happens in West Virginia with respect to homeschooling and around the country should alarm you, because they're not just interested in regulating home education. From my perspective, which is why what I've told many in West Virginia, if you care about parental rights, even if you're not a homeschooler, this should concern you.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hi, I'm Jim Mason, president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this is another episode of Homeschool Talks. Today we're going to talk with HSLDA Staff Attorney Kevin Boden about some recent developments in West Virginia and how those tie into threats to homeschool freedom more generally. So welcome, Kevin.
Thanks, Jim.
Kevin, tell us a little bit about yourself before we get going. How long you've been working here, what's your background, family, so forth.
Yeah. So I have been here at HSLDA for just over 2 years now, and we are a homeschool family. We have 8 children. Before I came to HSLDA, I was employed full-time in the Air Force, and so I had done that for about 13 years before the Lord called us and moved us here, and we've been homeschooling for 16, maybe 17 years now, and our kids range from 22 down to 4.
And I think you probably homeschool them, right?
We do homeschool them, yes.
Right. And you actually homeschool them in West Virginia.
We do.
So tell us what's happening in West Virginia.
Yeah, so we had a very tragic case in April of this year. The police showed up to a home in Boone County, West Virginia, and they discovered a teenager by the name of Kennedy Miller. And Kennedy Miller was found, according to news reports, emaciated to a skeletal state. Basically, from what they can tell, she was starved to death. And so that prompted, of course, an investigation, lots of media attention. And so that led us to talking about homeschooling today, because over the course of that investigation, it was revealed that, in fact, her mom had filed a notice of intent to homeschool in 2021.
And had she been brought to the attention of officials before she was tragically discovered to be dead?
She was, yeah. There's a couple of CPS reports or investigations that were done on other children in the home while she was growing up. And then in the spring of 2023, police showed up at the Miller home and did a child welfare check. And in that child welfare check, they didn't notice anything of physical concern, nothing that would cause them to think that she was malnourished or neglected or abused or anything of that. But they did have some concerns about mental health. And those stemmed from discussions that the police had with Kennedy and her, from what the police officer noted from his perspective, a unhealthy fear of COVID-19. And so based on this observation that the police officer had, he made an informal report to Department of Health Services. Nothing formal was filed. They do have a conduit for a formal report, nothing formal, but it was an informal notification in case they had some resources for Kennedy.
So this happened, I mean, there's sort of a after COVID element to this, as well as maybe some mental health issues. Was anything else involved? Poverty, anything like that?
Yeah, the report is that the family was, I mean, I don't know what their exact financial picture was, but certainly some concerns just about, the basic financial position of the family. It sounds like there's been no mention of the father. It sounds like the father was either not in the home, passed away, divorced, whatever the situation was, and present in the home or in the child's life, in Kennedy's life, would have been the mom and the grandparents, all of whom I think have been charged at this point criminally.
So child abuse is something that, obviously we condemn, and we think that folks should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law when it's proven. But how does this really involve homeschooling? It sounds like there's a lot of elements that went into this event.
Yeah, the homeschooling connection first came up with the notice of intent, and they used one of the state group's notification forms, just like HSLDA provides forms for our members. This state group in West Virginia had their own form. The family used that form, filed the notice of intent. And the homeschool connection, or when people have talked about it in the news, it really comes from the fact that under West Virginia law, the county has the discretion to follow up on a family if they do not receive one of the required assessments. So we talked a little bit earlier about how in spring of 23, the police did the check, had the mental health concerns about COVID-19. Well, June 30th of that year would have been Kennedy's 8th grade year. And under West Virginia law, she would have then been required to file that 8th grade assessment. And so the discussion now is the county did nothing when that assessment wasn't received. The county did nothing. And perhaps if the county would have followed up with the family based on the lack of assessment being provided, they would have perhaps caught something that may have been going on at that time. And so we don't know, but those are the connections that some are drawing.
So the police officer checked, made a referral to Child Protection, and the school had the authority to check up when they didn't receive the assessment. So why is the governor in West Virginia calling for new restrictions on homeschooling? Or back up maybe and tell us, what is the governor thinking about doing?
Yeah, so in response to this, the governor several weeks ago held a press conference, and the press conference was largely focused on some misinformation that he had put out as a result of bad information that he received from his agencies. Things like, well, we can't release any information. This is all private. It's all ongoing. And in fact, there under policies, regulations, and laws, there was information that could be provided. So there was lots of agency cross-pointing, if you will, within the state of West Virginia. And so when his chief of staff, Brian Abraham, conducted this press conference, the primary focus of that was what's going on holistically across the executive branch so that we can kind of level the bubble, so to speak, with the public. Present in that press conference was, I think, a representative from the state trooper's office, as well as Michelle Blatt, who is the state superintendent of education. And so one of the things that was discussed is tightening closing the loopholes on home education, tightening the restrictions. There was a mention of, for example, of what are the guardrails that are in place. And what the governor has proposed is a one-word change from a may to a shall. So, for example, Boone County, when they don't get the assessment on June 30th, instead of saying may take some action in circuit court, they want to change that to shall take some action so that they don't have the discretion which they exercise in this case, which is to do nothing. So that's at least one proposal in terms of legislative changes that the governor has supported.
And why is that a pressing issue now after the West Virginia legislature has closed for the year?
Well, there's a couple reasons that it's pressing. The first is, the West Virginia House did pass what they had called Rayleigh's Law in this past legislative session, and that would have been a restriction on home educators if there was an open case of abuse and neglect. So it has already been on at least the House of Delegates' mind on this type of oversight restriction requiring some approval. The other thing that is at play here politically, which I think is significant, is Governor Justice, of course, will not be the governor after this year. He's running for the U.S. Senate. And so when the elections happen later this year, Governor Justice will most certainly not be the governor of the state of West Virginia. And then you also have a Senate President, Craig Blair, who lost his primary earlier this year, and so will not be returning to the Senate when they start in January. And so those things that factor. So if they don't do anything during a special session in August, which we haven't talked about much yet, then it's unlikely or it's impossible that Governor Justice or the Senate President would be able to take any action.
The current governor and the current governor, Senate President.
Yes, exactly.
But they will have a governor and a Senate President in January.
Yes, they will have a governor. They'll have a Senate President. They'll have leadership, and they'll have the ability to affect whatever change they think is appropriate with the benefit of what's actually gone on, right? What types of reports, investigations will be concluded over the next 5 or 6 months that would then shed much light on what is an appropriate solution from a child welfare perspective, and so on and so forth.
So over the years, these kind of events happen from time to time. and the scrutiny on homeschooling often becomes very intense. Is it really a problem in homeschooling world?
No, it's not a problem. I think the homeschool, like every segment of society that you look at, whether it's the charter, just to take the education realm, whether it's the Hope Scholarship community in West Virginia, whether it's the Learning Pod community, whether it's the micro school community, the charter school community, the public school community, the homeschool community, people are people. As we know, we all have a sin nature. We're all prone to do things that we ought not do, and often do things that we wish we didn't do. And so this is certainly not unique to the homeschool community, but it also doesn't characterize the homeschool community in West Virginia or in any other state in the country.
Is there evidence to suggest that homeschooled children are more likely to be abused or neglected than other children?
No, there's been no studies to that effect.
Yeah, and in fact, the studies that I'm aware of say just the opposite. A study that just came out a little over a year ago by Brian Ray and Danny Shaquille, published in the Journal of School Choice, did a really comprehensive review comparing educational setting. And what they discovered was that educational setting has no causation or correlation to likelihood of abuse or neglect. Other factors do. Demographic situation, like is there a father in the home or a single or an unmarried male in the home, or are there mental health issues or poverty concerns, things like that are predictive, but educational setting is not. So why is it that homeschooling gets this kind of scrutiny when it happens like this?
Well, I think when homeschooling is involved, and I don't want to say that it's an easy target, but that's almost what it is. If you can shift the discussion and the narrative to home education, you avoid some of the other discussions that systemically you may have to have.
And there's also, the Supreme Court of the United States has said that, the fact that some parents may act against the interests of their children, even abusing and neglecting them, isn't cause to kind of discard generations and centuries of American tradition that understands that parents do look out for the best interests of their kids for the most part. I mean, it's just that's the way we view parental rights in this country, and the Supreme Court has actually said to kind of restrict the rights of all parents because some do bad things is repugnant to American tradition. That's the Supreme Court's word, repugnant to American tradition. And that's what these sort of really sad things that happen to kids trigger, and understandably so, a compassion and a desire to do something, to do anything. But why is that? Why should we resist that?
There was an article that came out in West Virginia, and the title of the article was, "Who Are They Protecting?" And the question, it was very anti-homeschooling. It was, why would the homeschool community oppose regulation that might protect some kids? And in fact, we saw this last spring. It was the debate on the House floor of West Virginia was, if this saves just one child. And there is a defense correlation. I go, our adversarial system is set up such that we would rather have a guilty person go free than a free person be convicted and go to jail. At least that's the theory, right? We can talk a different time about whether the justice system meets that intent, but that's why it's set up the way it is. And so when I go here, I answer that question, who is they protecting? In my mind, I go, what we're protecting is the fundamental right of every parent in America to direct the education upbringing of their child, and to not have that second guessed or regulated because one person doesn't do it properly. And I think at HSLDA, we really hold dear the Supreme Court case that they have the high duty to educate this children. We just don't see it as another educational option. I mean, here we see this as the absolute highest duty of a parent to educate, instruct, and care for their children. But you do have these increased calls for a very emotional response, and they want to do something. In my position, publicly, when I've talked to folks, including the governor's office, is it's okay to want to do something, but it's not okay to have a knee-jerk reaction to address what you think is the problem and turns out not to be the problem. And particularly when you have fundamental rights at play, which is what we've got here.
And the historical progression of the homeschooling movement over the last 4 or 5 decades simply doesn't bear out the narrative that's trying to be spun up these days. There's, in the last year, the Washington Post, Amazon Prime, ProPublica, the John Oliver Show, and then just a week or so ago, Scientific American weighed in as well. Why is that? Why is that troubling? To me, that's troubling.
I think it's troubling. These are mainstream outlets. They get lots of traction. They get lots of press. And I think, honestly, Jim, they do resonate with people. I think when people read these initially without maybe some deep thought into it, or knowing the historical fight for home education freedom, or knowing the Supreme Court jurisprudence that's at play here, I think there is a fair amount of just emotional appeal to folks. And it's very easy to go to the public in West Virginia, for example, and say, well, if this saves one kid, isn't it worth it? I mean, what person isn't going to knee-jerk say, yeah, I guess if it saves one kid, let's do it, until you step back and say these things that are trying to put in place would not have actually saved any of the children that they think are, it would not have had to have the effect that they think it will have. And so it sounds very appealing emotionally. So I think that's why these media outlets they gain some traction, because they appeal to some of the emotional arguments that frankly we all have. I mean, I'm right there with them going, what can we do? And if I'm not a homeschooler, if I don't understand the history, if I don't understand the freedom, if without that kind of understanding, having thought through it, I mean, I'd probably be prone to have the same response. It's like, well, why don't they check in with people? Why don't we make them submit annual assessments? Why don't we have a uniform standard at Scientific American? I mean, what's wrong with all these things? And so, it's our job, not our job per se, but to help people become informed of where do we came from, where are we, and where are we going. The other thing I'll add, Jim, is there's a bit of a narrative which came out in one of the superintendent's comments. And it was something along the lines of, as a collective state, we have to protect our children. So I'm a resident of West Virginia, as you mentioned at the beginning. I got 7 kids that live with me there. Our daughter's in college in Michigan. And I think to myself, I hear the superintendent say that, and I go, these are not our children. When the Supreme Court makes this decision, it actually gives Kevin and Wendy the high duty to educate these 7 children. Now, I'm not responsible for any others, but I'm responsible for these 7. So for a state bureaucrat, even someone like the state superintendent of education, a fairly significant position, to say, well, we as a state have a collective obligation for our children. I think to myself, whose children are she talking about? Because she has no obligation over my children. None. Zip. I mean, no obligation whatsoever. But I think that's instructive of the narrative that you see sometimes creeping in, is these actually really aren't the children of a mom and a dad, or of a caregiver, or of a parent. They're actually all of our children, and we have to collectively look out for them. And it's a narrative that I totally reject. I think it's very dangerous.
Yeah, that narrative goes back a ways. Before COVID, Elizabeth Bartholet, a Harvard law professor, famously called for a ban of homeschooling. She called it a presumptive ban. And by that, she meant maybe a couple of people, could get permission to homeschool. But for the most part, homeschooling would be outlawed. And one of her colleagues, a law professor at William & Mary, said something along the lines of, parents wouldn't have any rights over the education of their children unless the state gave it to them. I mean, that's a paraphrase, but he begins with that premise that children belong to the state, and parents are allowed to raise them as long as they do it the way the state wants. I think that finds its roots in where Elizabeth Bartholet started right before COVID. And I think maybe, there seems to be a certain ideology afoot in the country that resents the liberty that homeschooling parents have fought for these past 40 or 50 years.
I totally agree. And this is part of what I think the American public needs to understand. And because it's not just home education. I mean, the position, and we dealt with this here in Northern Virginia in the last election cycle, right? Where they say, well, you actually, as a parent, you can say what you want, but actually you don't have any say over what we teach your kids at school. And so even if your kid goes to public school, private school, unless you are just comfortable handing your child over to the state for all the compulsory ages that they want to take, and telling the state, teach them whatever you think is best and just send them back to me when you're done. If you're not comfortable with that position, then what happens in West Virginia with respect to homeschooling and around the country should alarm you, because they're not just interested in regulating home education. They're interested, I think, this ideology that Bartholet and maybe others have is interested in cutting out the parent from the rearing of children altogether. And you see it, certainly I see it internationally. A lot of countries have outlawed it for this very reason. And in many countries, it's lawful, but it's so highly regulated with these are the things you have to teach, and these are the tests you got to take, and these are the tutors you have to have. And it's like, I mean, it's the aura of freedom. It's the shadow of freedom, but there's no actual freedom at play there. You realize that actually you don't have anything to do or any say in the process. So from my perspective, which is why I've told many in West Virginia, if you care about parental rights, even if you're not a homeschooler, this should concern you, because the worldview at play goes far beyond home education.
So some of the regulations that are being promoted now kind of sound like they may be modest. Why should we be alarmed at modest sounding proposals today?
Well, I think we'd be alarmed because to me, it's pretty clear that that's not the end result. You know, it's kind of like the frog in the pot analogy, right? If you just put a frog in boiling water, it'll jump out because it realizes there's a problem. If you just put it in water and slowly turn up the heat, eventually it will find its life gone because the changes were so incremental. So that's what I see. I mean, it's pretty bold of Elizabeth to just call for a presumptive ban. And perhaps it was the quiet part out loud and that got people's attention. But if folks look around, they can see this type of worldview or ideology that's leading to these incremental changes. And I don't have any doubts that it's not just the one incremental change that they desire. It's one step towards a destination that they want to get to. And you can read things like, I think it's, I can't remember the name, Anna Catherine, maybe who came out after Bartholet. But it's all of these, it takes a village type mentality. It's these full service community schools where we want to have a cradle to career, educational model where we want to, have a child and mold them through the healthcare sector and the educational sector and the social sector. And they just want their kind of pause, if you will, over every aspect of child formation. And if they can cut the parent out, ultimately, then I don't think there's any doubts that that's what many in the state would do.
Well, Kevin, what are you planning coming up in West Virginia and other places to kind of educate lawmakers and others?
Yeah, so we've done quite a bit already. We were blessed to host a webinar with both a senator and a House delegate from West Virginia. So we hosted this webinar, invited anyone from West Virginia to dial in. Tons of questions along those lines. We've met with, I went with one state leader. We met with the representative from the governor's office just to talk about the special session. Of course, we're paying attention to whether he puts this homeschool agenda or item on the special session calendar. So word is still out on there. We're also continuing to, we're crafting a document to help homeschoolers understand really what the risks are and why this is worth paying attention to and fighting for, looking at creating a document for legislators to help them understand what the homeschool law is, why it's sufficient, what this type of legislation would and wouldn't do. And, continuing to, write op-eds and engage with the narrative in the media that has really been very favorable towards some type of action regulating homeschoolers. So getting our voice out in the court of public opinion on some of these ideologies that are at play and what some other solutions are to the problem that we face there. So to me, this is not an education issue. You don't deal with it with an education law fix. It's a child welfare and neglect issue, and you deal with it according to child welfare and neglect laws. So helping just to advance that narrative to our members, to HSLDA members, to the broader homeschool community, and then, of course, just to the public at large.
Well, I've been saying in speeches to homeschool conferences all year long that we are blessed in America today because homeschool freedom in most states has just progressed to the point where many, many more parents are able to enter into homeschooling to benefit their children. And I just want to really emphasize what Kevin was saying. We here at HSLDA and the vast majority of homeschool parents see this as a high calling, a duty, an obligation that we have to raise and educate, nurture our children. so that they can become effective and productive and happy adults. And so as these stories that arise are being used to reverse that, we need to be ready. All of us here at HSLDA, we're making plans to kind of thwart these on a case-by-case basis, but also on a bigger ideological basis, so that homeschoolers today and freedom-loving people all over understand where our freedom comes from and help us to preserve it and defend it and protect it. So with that, I just want to say thank you for your support out there. And if you'd like to learn more about HSLDA and what we're doing here, you can go to our website at hslda.org and find out what you can do to help in the cause of preserving homeschool freedom, because it's under threat in West Virginia. But what we do as a homeschooling community helps everyone everywhere. And we never know when the next threat to freedom is going to pop up. So the more we stand together, the stronger we all are. So once again, I'm Jim Mason, President of Homeschool Legal Defense, and this has been another episode of Homeschool Talks.
Today's program is made possible by HSLDA's legal support team. We know homeschooling isn't always easy. That's why we're committed to giving you peace of mind, so you can focus on giving your kids the best possible education. As an HSLDA member, you have access to customized legal advice from our team of attorneys to help you comply with your state's homeschool law, and will represent you if your right to homeschool is ever challenged, even in court. Every day, we help our members respond to overreaching officials, and we stand ready to defend your homeschool against unlawful attacks. To hear more about how you can enjoy a worry-free homeschool experience, visit hslda.org/join. That's hslda.org/join. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.